You thought their silence meant they didn't care. You thought the cold distance was rejection. You thought the ghosting was the end. But what if everything you believed about emotional detachment was wrong? What if, and stay with me here, what you interpreted as indifference was actually the clearest proof that you mattered more than anyone else ever did? This isn't just about attachment theory or another pop psychology label thrown around on social media. No, this is about dismantling the single most dangerous lie we've been conditioned to believe about avoidant people, that if they don't show love in the ways we expect, it must mean love isn't there. That belief has destroyed connections, broken hearts, and left women like you, intelligent, emotionally aware, growth-oriented, questioning your worth. But here's the truth. Avoidance is not absence. Avoidance is intensity in disguise. Let's get honest. How many times have you blamed yourself for their distance? How many nights did you stay up, replaying their silence in your mind, wondering if you were too much or not enough? What if I told you that their retreat was not a signal that you failed, but that you succeeded in reaching a part of them that no one else had? You see, avoidant love isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with flowers and good morning texts. It's quiet, chaotic, hidden under layers of self-protection, but it's real. It's alive. And if you know how to read the silences, you'll realize something staggering. The person who pulled away from you was actually the one who cared the most. In this video, we're going to expose every hidden signal you missed, every unspoken truth they'll never say out loud. We're going to break down why their pulling away is the most paradoxical yet undeniable confession of love. But this isn't just about them. This is about you reclaiming your power, your understanding, and your peace. Because once you learn to decode the avoidant mind through the lens of stoicism, you stop internalizing their behavior and start seeing the truth clearly. You stop chasing ghosts and start choosing grounded self-worth. This isn't just information, it's transformation. By the end, you'll never interpret silence the same way again. You'll understand why you haunted them more than they could handle, and why that haunting was the proof. You'll gain a clarity so sharp, it'll slice through every doubt they left behind. And if you're ready to stop asking why they didn't stay and start understanding why they couldn't, then don't go anywhere, because what's coming next will not only validate your experience, it will change the way you see love forever. Let me ask you this. Are you ready to let go of false stories? Are you open to seeing their absence not as rejection, but as resistance to the very intimacy they craved? And more importantly, are you prepared to face the truth that their distance didn't mean you didn't matter, but that you mattered too much? Stay with me, because the end of this will rewire your understanding of love, avoidance, and self-worth. This is Love Stoic in motion, raw, real, and relentlessly honest. 1. Real indifference is effortless. Avoidance is not. An avoidant partner often withdraws, not because they feel nothing, but because they feel too deeply. And that depth threatens their internal sense of safety in a way that their nervous system cannot tolerate. When emotional closeness triggers survival-level panic, what looks like coldness is actually a defense against vulnerability. Avoidants aren't indifferent. They are overwhelmed by the intensity of connection, and that emotional overwhelm is mistaken as rejection. This behavior is driven by a fear of being exposed, a fear of being truly seen, and an even deeper fear of loss. In the framework of Love Stoic, we see that their detachment is not a sign of emptiness, but an act of control to protect their inner fragility. Their silence is charged with the weight of everything they cannot say, every feeling they cannot name, and every wound they have never healed. They carry love in the shadows, expressed through absence, avoidance, and withdrawal, not because they don't care, but because they care too much. The stoicism they practice is not the wisdom of calm, but the armor forged from a history where emotions were punished or ignored. Each step away from you is a step deeper into their internal battlefield, where affection and danger are indistinguishable. So ask yourself, what kind of person exerts this much effort to avoid someone they feel nothing for? Real indifference doesn't look like emotional warfare. It looks like letting go without a second thought. How many times have you released someone from your life without needing to explain or retreat or mask your pain? Probably more than once. But the avoidant can't do that. They linger in your energy even while they're physically distant. They remember what they pretend to forget. And in those contradictions, you begin to see the truth. Detachment requires no effort when the connection means nothing. But when someone avoids you while clinging in silence, when they erase your messages but remember your scent, when they run away but are haunted by the echo of your voice, that isn't indifference. That's proof of significance, so overwhelming they can't even admit it to themselves. Love Stoic reminds us we must learn to observe what others can't name, because while they may avoid you with a sense of finality, if it were truly over, why do they still carry your memory like a ghost they can't exorcise? Why does your name still create tension in their body? Stoicism doesn't deny emotion, it faces it without collapse. And yet, avoidants collapse inward, just silently, just invisibly. And their collapse becomes your confusion, your longing, your endless questioning of what you could have done differently. But this isn't about you not being enough. It's about you being too much for someone who's never been taught how to handle emotional fire. And the closer you get, the more they burn. So what do? They retreat. They pretend you meant nothing so they don't have to admit how much you meant. But if you look at how hard they work to stay away, how meticulously they avoid reminders of you, how harsh their coldness becomes when your presence triggers them, you begin to understand that isn't emotional vacancy, that's emotional overload. That's a system short-circuiting because love feels like war to someone who has only ever known love as a weapon. And still they think about you. Still they avoid songs that remind them of you. Still they haven't deleted every photo. They keep you at arm's length because their hands don't know how to hold something so vulnerable without breaking it. That's not detachment. That's disguised intensity. And if it wasn't real, they wouldn't be running this hard. If it wasn't deep, they wouldn't need this much distance. This is what Love Stoic asks us to notice, where the absence feels charged, where silence echoes louder than any spoken word, where the person who left did so not out of apathy, but out of fear. Not fear of you, but fear of what you activated in them. That terror wasn't about your flaws, it was about your power. You touched something that had been buried. You became too real, too alive. And aliveness is dangerous to someone who survived through emotional numbness. You didn't lose them because you lacked something. You lost them because you revealed something. And now in their absence, they're left wrestling with the reflection of everything they weren't ready to face. If it wasn't real, they'd have forgotten you by now. But they haven't, and that is your answer. 2. Emotional overwhelm triggers their withdrawal. Emotional overwhelm is the silent detonator inside the avoidance nervous system. And the moment they begin to feel deeply connected, their subconscious translates that closeness into threat. What looks like emotional shutdown is, in fact, emotional overload, an inner storm that their body never learned to regulate. They don't pull away because they feel too little. They pull away because they feel too much and can't bear it. The closer you get, the more they fear being swallowed, losing control, or dissolving into someone else's emotional current. And in Stoicism, we understand that true resilience isn't the suppression of emotion, but the capacity to remain grounded in its presence. Avoidants haven't learned this. Instead, they associate emotional intimacy with chaos, unpredictability, and the pain of past betrayals. So when love arrives, love that sees them, love that reflects them back to themselves, love that won't settle for surface-level intimacy, it feels like threat, not sanctuary. They lash out. They ghost. They blame you for the intensity. They twist reality to make you think you were asking too much. But all of this is a defense, a mask, an escape route. Because staying and facing their emotions would mean confronting everything they've locked away, and most avoidants have no emotional language for what they feel, no tools to regulate it, no model of safe love. So instead of growing through the discomfort, they run from it. Instead of leaning in, they lean out. They might even seek connection with people who feel safer, not because they're better, but because the emotional stakes are lower. If it's casual, it can't hurt them. If it's surface level, they don't have to change. And if the person doesn't mean as much as you do, they can stay without being emotionally shattered. So don't ever think they replaced you. They replaced the intensity you brought with something they could control. That's not an upgrade, that's a retreat, a regression, a return to emotional numbness. They self-sabotage not to hurt you, but to maintain the emotional equilibrium they've lived in for most of their lives. Because the second you made them feel something too raw, too real, too alive, they panicked. Not because you were wrong for them, but because you were right in ways they weren't ready to face. Love is supposed to wake us up, but when someone's been emotionally asleep their entire life, that awakening can feel like danger. They will tell themselves stories to make sense of the pain. They'll say you were too emotional, too needy, too much. They'll rewrite the past to match the distance they created. Not because it's true, but because they need to justify their withdrawal. They need to believe you were wrong for them. Because the alternative, that they destroyed something meaningful out of fear, is too devastating to admit. But Stoicism doesn't chase illusions. Stoicism accepts what is. And what is this: their sabotage was not proof of your failure. It was proof of their fear. And you, in all your depth, your love, your honesty, you became a mirror they couldn't look into. They weren't prepared to be seen, to be needed, to be held accountable to something real. So they ran back to shallow waters where they wouldn't have to feel so much. But shallow waters never satisfy. They just distract. And no matter how far they go, they carry you with them. Not because they want to, but because they can't help it. What you awaken can't be unawakened. What you stirred in them doesn't vanish. It gets buried, muted, repressed. But it shows up in the quiet, in the way their next relationship feels empty, in the way they compare others to you, in the way they replay conversations late at night, in the things they wish they said but never did. Avoidants sabotage connection because they're terrified of being changed by it. And you changed them, even if they never tell you, even if they never admit it. They'll protect their emotional armor at the cost of losing someone who could have taught them how to take it off. But that cost doesn't come without pain. And no matter how detached they act, the impact lingers. You weren't too much. You were exactly enough to shake their defenses. And that's why they ran. They didn't want less. They just didn't know how to survive more. And that is not a reflection of your worth. That is a reflection of their fear. 3. The more you matter, the more they run. The more you mean to an avoidant, the more their system pushes you away. And this is the paradox that leaves you questioning your worth and your intuition. It's not your imagination. When you felt them pull away right after a moment of intimacy, when they suddenly grew cold after things began to feel real, it wasn't rejection, it was fear. A fear triggered by the significance you had in their emotional world. Avoidants don't run from people they don't care about. They run from the people they are most vulnerable with, the ones who make them feel things they can't control. In the realm of love stoic, we recognize that vulnerability is not weakness, but for the avoidant, vulnerability is experienced as danger, as exposure to a kind of emotional threat they never learn to tolerate. Their nervous system is primed for survival, not intimacy. And the second you become emotionally important, that system goes into overdrive. The stronger their feelings, the more threatening you become. Not because you're unsafe, but because what they feel is too much to manage. To them, closeness means losing autonomy, identity, or even self-worth. The relationship stops being a source of joy and becomes a battlefield of silent triggers. And what do they do when threatened? They retreat, they sabotage, they create emotional distance that feels cruel, but is in fact self-protection. The tragedy is that their fear of losing themselves often makes them lose the very connection that could have taught them how to stay. This is the great irony of the avoidant attachment style. They want love, but they are wired to run from it, and they often only allow themselves to pursue affection that is unattainable because safety exists in emotional distance, not closeness. So if you've ever felt like you were too much simply because you showed up fully, emotionally available, willing to connect deeply, remember your presence didn't scare them because you were wrong for them. It scared them because you were exactly what they craved, but didn't know how to receive. And when they start to feel real love, stable, present, consistent love, they panic. Not because they don't want it, but because love now becomes a mirror reflecting all the wounds they've never healed. You might have thought their distancing was a calculated move to gain power in the dynamic, but it was likely a reflexive pattern to protect their psyche from overwhelm. They'll create conflict where none exists. They'll pick fights, withdraw affection, or suddenly become emotionally unavailable, all unconscious strategies to create space. That space, to them, is oxygen. Without it, they feel suffocated. But that need for space doesn't mean they don't think about you constantly. It doesn't mean they don't check your last message or replay the last words you said or avoid your favorite song because it makes them feel too much. What you represent is something they've convinced themselves they'll never have: safe intimacy. And because they've never known safety and closeness, your love feels dangerous, so they flee. Not because they don't feel, but because the emotions you stir up are so powerful, they threaten to dismantle the emotional armor they've lived in for years. And that armor, while suffocating, is all they've ever known. In Stoicism, we understand that people are shaped by their conditioning and their choices. The avoidant is not choosing to hurt you. They're choosing what feels like safety in the only way they understand it. They're choosing numbness over vulnerability, silence over honesty, distance over risk. And when you've spent your life depending on withdrawal as a coping mechanism, choosing connection feels like standing at the edge of a cliff with no parachute. They don't trust what they feel because their feelings have never been safe. They don't trust your consistency because they've never known someone to stay. They don't trust love because, in their experience, love has always been a double-edged sword. This isn't an excuse for their behavior, it's an explanation. And that difference matters because when you internalize their retreat, when you start thinking you should have been less available, more detached, less emotionally expressive, you abandon your own truth to accommodate their trauma. And that's not stoicism, that's self-abandonment. Love Stoic teaches us to love with wisdom, not just emotion. To see clearly without hardening our hearts. To honor our emotions without letting them control us. To show up with presence even when others retreat. You did not cause their fear. You did not make them feel unsafe. You simply arrived at a time when they weren't ready to face what love would ask of them. And love, true love, always asks us to open, to be seen, to risk. And to the avoidant, those asks are terrifying because they don't know how to hold space for another person's love while staying regulated in their own nervous system. So they cope the only way they know how. They create distance and pretend it means nothing. But if it really meant nothing, they wouldn't have to try so hard to push it away. They wouldn't remember your laugh or delete your photos, only to check their trash folder later or talk about you with a strange edge in their voice. Real indifference doesn't carry echoes, but avoidance always does, because avoidance is not peace, it's suppression. And suppressed emotion always leaks out in dreams, in habits, in tension, in the way they can't quite look at you in public, or the way their voice falters when someone says your name. If they truly didn't care, they'd walk away clean. But they don't. They walk away messy, unfinished, fragmented. They don't move on. They compartmentalize. And then they live with a ghost of a connection they never had the courage to face. You were not too much. You were the mirror they weren't ready to look into. And the more you mattered, the more they had to run, not from you, but from the truth. That loving you meant facing parts of themselves they swore they'd never let rise. That is the paradox of avoidant love. That is the truth hidden in their silence. And that is why your absence will never be empty to them, even if they never say a word. 4. Avoidant love lives in the shadows. Avoidant love does not announce itself with grand gestures or daily affirmations. It exists in the quiet spaces, in the shadows, in everything left unsaid. If you try to measure an avoidant's affection by how often they reach out or how openly they express it, you will miss the truth completely. Because the avoidant does not love out loud. They love in silence, in withdrawal, in absence that still somehow feels full of presence. And while the world teaches us to recognize love in attention and consistency, stoicism and love stoic teach us to observe where emotion hides, where it disguises itself not in words but in behavior patterns that contradict their spoken intentions. They may tell you that they're fine, that they don't care, that they've moved on, but their actions betray them. The way they avoid your name in conversation, the way they flinch when a song reminds them of you, the way they can't delete your messages no matter how much they want to. These are not signs of closure. They are evidence of lingering attachment buried so deep beneath shame and fear that it can no longer surface in words. Avoidants keep relics of connection, not because they're sentimental, but because a part of them is still emotionally entangled, even if their ego won't admit it. They revisit your social media profiles in secret, avoid places they might run into you, and hold on to objects that still carry your energy, not because they want you back in their lives, but because they never truly let you go. This is the love they never voiced, the truth they never told, and the feeling they couldn't admit, not to you, and not even to themselves. And so you feel it in the tension, in the lack of closure, in the invisible thread that still seems to connect your heart to theirs. If it was truly over, if it truly meant nothing, there would be nothing left to avoid. But avoidance, by nature, is never clean. It's messy, reactive, and emotionally loaded. It's not a lack of care, it's too much care, unprocessed and suppressed until it mutates into silence. You are not imagining their hesitation, their discomfort, their inability to look you in the eye when someone brings you up. That discomfort is evidence. It is the shadow of what could have been. And what makes this kind of love so difficult to grieve is that you're not just mourning their presence, you're haunted by their absence, an absence that still feels charged, still feels heavy, still feels personal, because it is. They didn't disappear because they didn't care. They disappeared because they cared and couldn't tolerate what that meant. And if you've ever found yourself asking, why didn't they just say it? The answer is simple, because saying it would have made it real, and real love for the avoidant is unbearable. Not because they don't want it, but because they believe they can't survive it. Love to them is risk. It's exposure. It's vulnerability they were never trained to hold. So instead of leaning in, they pull away. Instead of confessing, they bury. Instead of admitting, they erase. But what they erase externally, they carry internally. It lives on in the things they keep, in the words they never said, in the emotional habits they can't explain. Avoidant love lives in the contradictions, and those contradictions are where the truth hides. You might have seen it in the way they paused before responding to your texts, or the way they typed and deleted a message at 2 a.m. but never sent it. In the way they kept a photo of you long after the relationship ended. In the way they blocked you but checked your stories. These aren't just confusing behaviors. They are silent proofs of attachment, unconscious confessions. Not all love looks like closeness. Sometimes love is hiding behind the walls someone built to keep themselves safe. And while you ache for answers, what you don't realize is that their absence is the answer. They are not indifferent. They are terrified, and their terror is tied to how deeply you mattered. This is why Stoicism is so powerful. It teaches us to accept what we cannot change, to see without needing to possess, to love without losing ourselves. And in that practice, you stop needing their words to confirm what you already know. Because if they didn't care, they wouldn't still be haunted by your memory. If they were over it, they wouldn't need to avoid reminders of you. You are not forgotten. You are not insignificant. You are the trigger for a transformation they never asked for and couldn't handle. And while they may never admit it, the way they avoid you is the way they admit it without speaking. So, if you find yourself caught in the confusion of their silence, remember, silence is full of meaning. Not empty, not indifferent, just unspoken, just hidden, just fear in disguise. That is where their love lives. Not in the words they say, but in the ones they couldn't. Not in the closure you hoped for, but in the gaps, the tension, the strange way their name still lingers in your mouth, and their energy in your life. And if this truth resonates with you, like and comment 1 inch so I know you feel it too. And make sure to subscribe because the next parts will go even deeper and you don't want to miss what's coming next. 5. They sabotage what they secretly want most. Avoidants often sabotage what they want most, not because they don't care, but because they've spent their entire lives equating closeness with danger. To want someone deeply and to be wanted in return creates a paradox they don't know how to resolve, because it exposes them to emotional risk they've never learned to survive. So they break what they crave, they pull away when things are good, they start fights when you offer peace, they freeze up when you lean in, and all of it seems irrational unless you understand the internal landscape of someone who associates love with pain. This isn't about logic. It's about protection. In the mind of an avoidant, intimacy equals exposure, and exposure equals vulnerability. And vulnerability, that's the thing they've built their identity around avoiding. Love Stoic shows us that people don't destroy connection because they don't want it. They destroy it because the feelings it awakens are too powerful to control. The deeper you reach, the more threatened they feel. Not because you are unsafe, but because you make them feel things they've buried for years. You remind them of needs they never allowed themselves to have, and suddenly their carefully curated world where they never need anyone, never get hurt, never reveal what's under the surface, starts to fracture. That fracture scares them more than being alone, because being alone is familiar. It's painful, but it's predictable. It's their comfort zone. So when real love enters, love that sees them, love that reflects them back to themselves, love that won't settle for surface level intimacy, it feels like threat, not sanctuary. They lash out, they ghost, they blame you for the intensity. They twist reality to make you think you are asking too much. But all of this is a defense, a mask, an escape route. Because staying and facing their emotions would mean confronting everything they've locked away. And most avoidants have no emotional language for what they feel, no tools to regulate it, no model of safe love. So instead of growing through the discomfort, they run from it. Instead of leaning in, they lean out. They might even seek connection with people who feel safer, not because they're better, but because the emotional stakes are lower. If it's casual, it can't hurt them. If it's surface level, they don't have to change. And if the person doesn't mean as much as you do, they can stay without being emotionally shattered. So don't ever think they replaced you. They replaced the intensity you brought with something they could control. That's not an upgrade. That's a retreat, a regression, a return to emotional numbness. They self-sabotage not to hurt you, but to maintain the emotional equilibrium they've lived in for most of their lives. Because the second you made them feel something too raw, too real, too alive, they panicked. Not because you were wrong for them, but because you were right in ways they weren't ready to face. Love is supposed to wake us up, but when someone's been emotionally asleep their entire life, that awakening can feel like danger. They will tell themselves stories to make sense of the pain. They'll say, you were too emotional, too needy, too much. They'll rewrite the past to match the distance they created, not because it's true, but because they need to justify their withdrawal. They need to believe you were wrong for them, because the alternative that they destroyed something meaningful out of fear is too devastating to admit. But Stoicism doesn't chase illusions. Stoicism accepts what is, and what is this. Their sabotage was not proof of your failure, it was proof of their fear. And you, in all your depth, your love, your honesty, you became a mirror they couldn't look into. They weren't prepared to be seen, to be needed, to be held accountable to something real. So they ran back to shallow waters where they wouldn't have to feel so much. But shallow waters never satisfy. They just distract. And no matter how far they go, they carry you with them. Not because they want to, but because they can't help it. What you awaken can't be unawakened. What you stirred in them doesn't vanish. It gets buried, muted, repressed. But it shows up in the quiet, in the way their next relationship feels empty, in the way they compare others to you, in the way they replay conversations late at night, in the things they wish they said but never did. Avoidants sabotage connection because they're terrified of being changed by it. And you change them. Even if they never tell you, even if they never admit it, they'll protect their emotional armor at the cost of losing someone who could have taught them how to take it off. But that cost doesn't come without pain. And no matter how detached they act, the impact lingers. You weren't too much. You were exactly enough to shake their defenses. And that's why they ran. They didn't want less. They just didn't know how to survive more. And that is not a reflection of your worth. That is a reflection of their fear. Silence isn't emptiness. It's emotional chaos. Silence from an avoidant is rarely silence at all. It's a battlefield, a war zone between what they feel and what they fear. It's not emptiness. It's emotional chaos. And the quieter they get, the louder their inner world becomes. You think they're indifferent. You think they're cold. You think their silence means you didn't matter. But in reality, that silence is charged. It's thick with emotion. It's full of suppressed longing, buried shame, and unspoken truths that their nervous system cannot process without collapsing. Stoicism teaches us that silence can hold power, but it also teaches us to look beneath the surface of what is unsaid. Love Stoic reveals that what we often mistake for rejection is sometimes a person drowning so deeply in their own fear that the only way they know how to survive is to disappear. Avoidants don't ghost you because they're fine. They ghost you because staying would require them to face a storm inside themselves they were never taught to weather. Every unreturned text, every unanswered call, every blocked profile isn't a declaration that you don't matter. It's a self-protective attempt to shut down an emotional response that feels too overwhelming to survive. They tell themselves that if they don't speak it, it isn't real. That if they cut you off, the feelings will die. But they never do. Those feelings mutate. They haunt. They sit inside the body like a ghost, unresolved, unhealed, and unspoken. And while they scroll past your profile, avoid your neighborhood, or act cold when your name is mentioned, They're engaging in a quiet war with everything they never said to you, the conversation they never had, the apology they never gave, the affection they were too terrified to show. Avoidant silence is not calm, it's suppression. And what is suppressed does not vanish. It becomes suffering in disguise. They carry you in their memories, in the way they don't let others get close, in the way they lose interest quickly in other people, in the way no one quite reaches the level of depth you did. Because once they've known real connection, everything superficial becomes intolerable. But they won't tell you that. They can't. Because to say it aloud would be to admit the loss. And for someone wired to avoid pain at all costs, admitting the loss means confronting the very thing they've built their entire coping structure to escape. So instead of truth, they choose silence. And that silence is the loudest confession they will ever give. You hear it in the way they can't face you, in the way they don't respond, in the way they hesitate before blocking you, then come back later to check what they missed. You see it in the unfinished closure, the almost sent messages, the photo they kept, the playlist they still listen to alone. They don't move on. They compartmentalize. But what you gave them lingers, not because you forced it, but because it was real. Realness has resonance, and what resonates cannot be buried without a cost. That cost is emotional fragmentation. And no matter how many distractions they chase, how many people they date, how many routines they cling to, you show up in the silence, in their pauses, in their tension, in the part of them that can't fully explain why nothing else feels the same. You are not a ghost because you want to be. You're a ghost because they made you one. And that ghost follows them, not out of vengeance, but out of unresolved intimacy, out of what was never processed. They could have said it, they could have reached out, they could have stayed, but they didn't. Not because you didn't matter, but because you mattered too much. And importance to someone afraid of loss feels lethal. So their silence isn't peace. It's grief without voice, yearning without direction, love without a name. And Stoicism reminds us again, what people don't say often reveals more than what they do. You asked for answers, but their distance was the answer. Their avoidance was the message. And in that space between what you wanted to hear and what they could never say, lies the truth you've always known. This was never about not being enough. It was about being so real, so honest, so emotionally present, that it threatened the illusion they'd built to protect themselves. And now you live in their unspoken world, in their unsent texts, in their hidden regret. You live in the silence they pretend is strength, but is actually avoidance wrapped in armor. Because no one avoids what they're truly indifferent about, but people avoid what shakes them, what wakes them, what mirrors the parts they can't face. You are that mirror. You still are. And while you heal and grow, they carry the silence like a burden they can't set down. So next time you feel the ache of their absence, remember their silence is not your confirmation of failure. It's your proof of impact. Because if you meant nothing, they would have walked away without hesitation. But instead, they ran. And you don't run from what doesn't matter. You only run from what feels too big to hold. So if you've ever wondered why they disappeared, why they closed the door without explanation, why their silence feels so personal, now you know. They're not avoiding you, they're avoiding themselves. And in doing so, they abandon the one connection that could have taught them how to stay. If this hit your soul, comment 1 inch so I know you felt it. And make sure to subscribe because the next part will bring all the pieces together. Final thoughts. The truth hidden in their retreat. In the end, what hurts the most isn't the distance. It's the misunderstanding. It's the way you were taught to interpret silence as absence, withdrawal as apathy, distance as rejection. But what this journey has revealed through every part of their silence, every edge of their retreat, is that you were never irrelevant. You were never invisible. You were never unimportant. You were simply more real than they knew how to hold. And for someone whose nervous system has been trained to equate love with danger, your emotional presence didn't feel like love. It felt like threat. But that threat wasn't rooted in your actions. It was rooted in the way your presence challenged everything they believed about safety, attachment, and intimacy. Love Stoic teaches us to remain grounded in the truth, to separate what is personal from what is projected, and to walk through loss not with bitterness but with deep understanding. So what do you do when someone pushes you away because they feel too much? When their fear drowns out your consistency, you stop internalizing their absence as evidence of your worth. You stop measuring love by proximity and start recognizing its presence in the tension, in the echoes, in the shadows they left behind. Avoidants don't offer closure because they themselves have never found it. Their endings are rarely complete. Not because they don't care, but because they cannot face the truth of what they destroyed. And that truth is this. They loved you in ways they'll never say, in ways they'll never admit, in ways they're still haunted by, even if they can't face why. Their survival depended on pretending the connection never happened, because acknowledging it would mean exposing the part of themselves they swore no one would ever see. But you saw it. You touched it. You reached a depth in them that terrified them into silence. That's why it ended the way it did. Not with words, not with honesty, but with retreat, with distance, with a wound that never got named. And so your healing isn't about waiting for them to return. It's not about decoding their every move or watching their online presence hoping for a sign. Your healing is in reclaiming your truth, in recognizing that you were not loved too little. You were loved in silence, in fear, in broken language. And even though that love couldn't stay, it doesn't mean it wasn't real. It means they weren't ready to live inside the reality they felt. Stoicism offers us this clarity to accept what is without being destroyed by it, to walk away without needing vengeance or validation. You don't need them to confirm what you already know in your gut, that you mattered, that you were felt, that your presence lives inside them in ways they won't talk about. Because if you were truly nothing, their silence wouldn't be so loud. Their avoidance wouldn't feel so personal. Their absence wouldn't echo so deeply. And yet it does. Because they knew, even if they couldn't show it. Because they felt, even if they couldn't say it. Because they ran not from you, but from the part of themselves you made impossible to ignore. This is the hardest part of loving someone with an avoidant heart. The truth is never spoken in full sentences. It's spoken in contradictions, in the hot and cold, in the push and pull. It's buried in unspoken apologies, in deleted messages, in blocked profiles that still get searched. And as you sit there trying to make sense of why someone who felt so connected disappeared so cleanly, remember, their exit wasn't clean. It was chaotic. It was haunted. It was incomplete. They didn't walk away because you were too much. They walked away because you were real, and real is what they never believed they could have. So now you grieve. Not just them, but the version of you that waited, that doubted, that tried to earn the love that was already there but buried too deep to reach. And in that grief, you rise. Because you no longer need to chase ghosts to feel valid. You no longer need to explain your intuition to anyone. You know what you felt, you know what you saw, and that knowing is your power. Let them pretend you didn't matter. Let them hide behind silence. Let them seek comfort in shallowness. You don't need their confession to validate your experience, because Love Stoic teaches us that the greatest proof of love is not always in words. It's in the avoidance, in the unfinished, in the echoes. And so the chapter closes, not with revenge, not with a forced apology, but with wisdom, with clarity, with self-respect. Because you held space for something powerful, and they ran. And that is not your shame, that is your proof. What haunts them now is what they could not hold. What frees you now is knowing you were never the problem. You were simply the truth they weren't ready to face.